Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. Firstly, forgive me if there's noise coming from the background. They've decided that now's a great time to be working on some stuff in the complex. I guess it's good. It's Christmas in a couple of days. Got to be clean and tidy. Right, this video is officially about sample bit rates and sample rates. So sample depths and all this kind of stuff that people get, well, murderous about. And I see why they do it, but there is little logic to a lot of it. Seeing we work in digital now, then we should at least understand the basics and know what's worth worrying about and what's absolutely not worth worrying about. First thing with worry is that we should only ever worry about what we control. If you can't control it, what's the point of worrying about it? But that is the nature of worry, that we like to worry about what we can't control because it gives us this whole adrenaline rush. Hence why people get so murdery about you're not agreeing with their opinions on bit rates, sample rates, and what have you. But remember, you're here to make music, I assume. Therefore, focus on making music. If it gets the music done, even though there may be some kind of imperfection, which is probably somebody else's idea of imperfection, then you've got it done. There are plenty of older records that we can go have a listen to, and we could point fingers and say, well, they suck because of this, that, and the other technicality. Let's say Bat Out of Hell. I commonly choose that as a record that doesn't actually sound very good. But oh my God, what a record. If we were to throw that away based on its technical limitations, then we would actually be, well, we'd be throwing away an important part of our culture, an important part of our humanity, not to mention the work of Mr. Loaf and Mr. Steinman, which would obviously be quite disrespectful to them. So the other thing that marries in with this is that as much as possible, my approach is what I refer to as non-pedantic. So I'm looking for, as I'm saying, a practical, workable view of these things, not a, that's perfectly correct based upon, something to the 75th percentile point, because, well, that's pointless. Bit and sample rates are how much computery information is held about our audio stuff as we're doing it. Theory would, on the surface, if you've got half a theory, suggest, well, the more the better. Yeah, but there are some greater minds than ours who have worked on this, and sampling as such, reproducing audio in the digital form, was really all understood by, I think it was the 50s, Mr. Nyquist of Bell Laboratories, back when they employed lots and lots of people just to think about stuff and work out how to make things new and exciting. They worked it all out. The reason that they couldn't enact it at the time, we couldn't have had video phone calls and stuff like that, was simply the level of affordable technology. They could do it in a lab, but in terms of rolling it out to the masses, it wasn't practical or affordable. So sampling became practical and affordable as the mid-80s came through, but still not affordable for most people. It wasn't till the late 90s where we all started to be able to move digital stuff backwards and forwards on the internet, largely pictures of kittens and pornography. So the standards that were set in, well, I'm not sure exactly what date, but by the early to mid-80s when CD appeared, was 16-bit with 44K sample rate. Now, people will eternally tell you that that's wrong, but you know what? It's actually correct. 16-bit 44.1 works. The other standard that has been adopted a little bit later, and I know very little about it, is 1648, 16-bit 48K. And it's not about it being better quality, it was just because they were able to interleave their number of frames in their audio with their video better. There are some people who don't worry about this stuff because they know they can't control it. I'm partly one of them, but I'm also partly one of those people who doesn't bother about it as much because my DAW is rate agnostic, as in Reason doesn't really care what you put into it. You can put anything into it that it accepts. I think it even accepts MP3 now, assuming you want to do that. But it'll accept any rate that you put into it that's reasonable, and it just handles it like, yep, why would we worrying about this? And that to me makes perfect sense, because why would we be worrying about it? That's what we have computers for, to say, yeah, it's all right, I'll do that for you. That's a good thing, and it does colour my opinion. Some people work with DAWs that are not rate agnostic, and you're constantly having to fuss about what rates things are at, otherwise they might play back at different speeds. While I get that it happens, I don't get that it should happen at all, because as I said, that's what computers are for, to do that stuff for us. We also need to be aware in these arguments that some of what people talk about is just out of date. In the early days, I remember hearing a CD player. This would have been 86 probably, but that was still pretty early, going into a hi-fi store and there with my da and the hi-fi guys talking about, amazing quality, and my father sort of said, well, okay, let's have a listening to this. The guy puts on the 1812, Canons, must be great quality. And I think it was a Yamaha store, so it was probably natural sound stuff. For all I recall, it could have been NS10s that we were playing on. My father didn't like it. I wasn't sure that I was wrapped either, not that I was fully up on quality at that age. But the reality was that it did sound hard and harsh. Now, if it was NS10s, I think we can all understand why, but it did sound a little hard and harsh, and CD was prone to doing that. But it wasn't the fault of the bit and sample rate that's being used, as some people would try to suggest. It was just to do with the quality of the gear that was used. Let's take NS10s out of the equation. Let's assume we had the loveliest speakers, the loveliest amplifiers. There were some issues with regards to getting from the D to the A. So digital analog converters, DA converters, weren't the best. It was like when I had my Casio CZ 1000, it was about 85, and the DA converters in that were, well, they were affordable, shall we say. They were prone to wandering, which meant that over time, your CZ actually started to sound different from every other CZ. And some of them developed a really unique and grindy tone. Some of them almost seemed to sound more and more like DX7s as time went by. So it depends what you wanted or what you got as to whether that was or a good or bad thing. But early conversion was not great. And then I remember things like 1-bit or bit 1 conversions, mash conversions, which were all about doing the math to return what really has happened on the disc to what's actually coming out of your speakers. And so we shouldn't make judgments about bit and sample rate based upon old ideas or old technology. We should make them based around the technology we got right now. And the reality is, unless there's something kooky about you and your world circumstances, chances are you're running a 64-bit system and you are using reasonable, decent quality gear. I'd pick it up and show you, but I've got an Audient Evo 4, which is a cheapy interface over there. Sounds bloody brilliant. So there's nothing really wrong with our technology now. If something seems wrong, it's probably somewhere else. Bit depth. Now again, this is non-pedantic, and I'm trying to explain this in the simplest terms possible without getting all kind of mathy on you. Quite simply, we've got the bit rate and then the sample rate. Let's look at bit rate first. Bit rate is merely the amount of words or information that is contained in every slice. So a sample is a slice of time. In this case, I've said, well, this is the number of slices per second, which if we're running at a sample rate of 44,100 is, well, 44,100 slices per second. But for the moment with this image, we're going to start with a bit rate that contains 2 words. You can think of them as being like bytes. We don't need to fuss pedantically, remember, but we might say I've got 2 words and 2 samples per second. So that's this much depth and this many slices. Now, obviously, we've got some difficulties with that because we can see that those blocks look like a Rubik's Cube. They're big, so we are going to end up with a chunkified sound. Here is a nice, lovely DX7 style electric piano. Lovely, shiny, perfect, full bitrate. If we lower our bitrate, Initially, nothing much seems to happen, but then, oh, suddenly it starts to get buzzy. And notice that as the sound gets quieter, it gets buzzier. In simple terms, your bit rate controls a lot more of the amount of volume, level, or dynamic range that you can have. And sampling appears to work upside down in the sense that it starts at fully loud and then goes to soft, rather than starts at invisibly soft up to fully loud. Therefore, a quiet sound at a high bit rate will reproduce, shall we say, perfectly. But as we reduce our bit rate, even though we've got a high sample rate, it gets less audible, gets quieter, until we get to the point where quiet sounds simply disappear. It can't work out what to do with them. So in many ways, I could or should have drawn this image with this Rubik's Cube here hanging off the 0 dB thing. So this half would have been empty, this bit would have been full. Because quiet sounds just cease to exist. You can't get a great dynamic range until you've gotten, say, 16 bits. 16 bits delivers a 96 dB dynamic range. And before you go, oh, but it needs to be more, most people can't hear anything greater than about 50 or 60 dB maximum as a viable range. Therefore, another 30 or so dB is more than we actually really need, but it's good to have it. I would argue against reducing it, but a lot of things, once you get to about minus 54 dB, people will go, that's silent. So you can think of, in very simple terms, your bit rate defining how much level we can actually have. Now, the reason I drew this from the bottom is that if we work our way across here, we've doubled our bit rate but kept our sample rate exactly where it was, which is equivalent to what I'm doing here. I'm playing with bit rate but not sample rate. Here we've doubled our bit rate and sample rate, but for the moment we've doubled our bit rate here. Let's say that is 16-bit, let's assume, and so that's like fully great. Adding more bit depth isn't really going to add anything, because remember, 96 dB of dynamic range is, well, it's plenty. It's more than we practically use. 24-bit delivers 144 dB, which is far in excess of what we're capable of perceiving. So there's not an awful lot of sense as such in going to it, but people will tell you should. The one reason that a 24-bit or a 32 or a 64-bit recorder would be of potential advantage is simply, as you see, it's got more level range. So if I were one of those people that went around recording orange presidents with amazing hair, and they have a habit of shouting really loudly or whispering, then I could struggle, especially if I had, let's say, an 8-bit recorder, because I'd only get the bits where they were loud, and I'd lose the bits where they were quiet, or I'd turn up my levels and get the bits when they were quiet, and then my levels would blow. I'd be over the magic number of 0 when they started to shout, therefore all I would have would be a distorted mess. And it would be a frustrating occurrence one way or another. If I could up my bit rate of my recording, I could allow for a much larger dynamic range. So my orange president with bouffant hair could whisper and be heard, and shout and be recorded without being distorted. So the argument that's for 24, 32, 64-bit depths is simply that it allows for a greater range, but it doesn't improve human hearing, so there is no particular advantage in making it a standard in playback, and no particular advantage whatsoever in making it a standard in mixing. Recording, yes, because what could happen is, let's say I've got my bouffant orange president, and his whisperings and his rantings are here. Now I can find some sort of mix engineering way of solving that. Maybe turn up the volume when he's whispering, turn down the volume when he's ranting, apply a mofo of a compressor to him, mollot him into that kind of a dynamic range so that we can hear his whole dynamic range over any ordinary sort of a system. But once we've achieved this, we no longer need 24, 32, or 64-bit in our range. That is the bit rate. So that's simply how many words, how many blocks of information between nothing and fully loud dude, or fully loud and nothing, depending on which way you want to think about it, that we're going to accept. Obviously, if we accept too few, we run the risk of hearing nothing, or what we do hear sounding pretty gnarly, not pleasing in any way at all. Then we've got sample rate. We can think of sample rate as being essentially the frequency range that we can hear. So in very simple terms, whatever our sample rate is, we will hear half of that as our upper frequency. So the standard for a CD, 1644, so 44,100, commonly referred to as 44.1 or just 44, 1644, will deliver a maximum hearable frequency of 22,050 hertz. Now we might be like, how dare they remove all those cool hertz that we want? Well, before it hurts you too badly, the reality is, at best, human hearing is essentially 20 to 20. 20 being the low end, the whoop, 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 whoop kind of sound that you really can't hear but maybe can perceive, up to 20,000 hertz. Much past that, there's not really anything there, and most people can't really hear much between about 50 and 8, 10, 12, 14 maybe. But 8 is pretty common, especially amongst older people, or people who go to concerts, or people who jam earbuds in and then play them so loudly that everyone else on the train can hear their lamentable love for Kanye. So obsessing again about that, needing all that extra range, is pretty pointless. Not because people are deaf, not because people don't have good enough sound systems, but simply because humans can't use it. So what's the point of lumbering our hard drives with it, lumbering our processing speed with it, because we could use the processing speed for something else. I don't know, more cat pictures, more pornography. We don't need more hertz. We don't need more frequency range. If we were to go up to 192,000 frames as our sample rate, then we get access to a full 96,000 hertz. But remember, effectively, there's nothing useful for us above about 20. There is a case in which that's useful, and we'll discuss that a bit later, but broadly speaking, it has no purpose. Hence, 1644 being chosen because it's good and it works. So if we listen to a sample rate here and we keep our bit rate high but reduce our sample rate, hear how quickly it starts to tear. This is why we do want a reasonably high sample rate. There's no parameter value on this to tell me what actual real-world numbers I might be getting, but let's assume that that was sort of 8-bit, 22K. Sounds about right. Now, this doesn't actually get grainy. It's not like we're realistically hearing gaps between the samples. It's not like watching a film that goes down to a frame rate of 4 per second, where we're like in stroboscope, because there's still enough frames for us to see it, hear it, contiguous. And we only need 24, 25 frames for us to be very comfortable that this is moving motion. We'll even tolerate 10. But what happens is that the gap between the samples gets a little great, and we've then got stepping. And that stepping creates the difference between a sine wave and, let's say, a square wave, which is a rigid, hard edge. Hard-edged things in sand create overtones and sand, well, hard. So you can hear how the sand becomes hard. Instead of being beautiful and smooth, it becomes hard. So again, 1644, the sample rate that was established for CDs is absolutely plenty for all practical work in all practical applications. Now, some of our applications are just a little beyond practical, so we do need to consider them. There's going to be somebody who's already trying to go, oh, but dude, analog is better. Let's start with, and I said that there are some things that we worry about that are not entirely true. They may have been true once, but they are not true now and haven't been true for an extremely long period of time, decades. But it doesn't stop people from telling us that to advance their own emotive argument. You might need to ask them why they're advancing this emotive argument, but chances are they probably can't really answer you that because they don't understand themselves. So you see charts a lot like this. On the one side, we've got the analog. Oh, it's absolutely perfect. This is like, it's like growing grass in the backyard, man. It's like, it's the source. That's our perfect sine wave. My perfect sine wave isn't very perfect because I drew it, but let's assume it is. And then on the other side, we're given this digital monstrosity where our sample rate is down at about 8 frames per second, and it is slicey dicey. So that's this kind of thing. Lovely. To say that that is what sampling sounds like is disingenuous at best, but absolute, well, not very accurate stuff in reality. Yes, as a simplistic representation of what it looks like if we take many slices, that is accurate. But to extrapolate to say that that makes all digital audio bunkum and therefore evil and not like natural grass, man, is just, it's BS of the highest order. As I did say earlier on, the early sample playback wasn't as good as it is now, and a lot of that was because we didn't have the processing power. The logic had been worked out back in the 50s or whatever it was. Go look it up on Wikipedia if you really need to know the numbers. I don't care about the numbers. Broadly, it's good enough. The understanding of how to create the perfect waveform after taking time slices, enough of them to justify the content, was all established. But the affordability of computing power, of like a calculator, to sit there and do non-stop, wasn't great. So once we got to that affordability, then we could put in the extra little chip, like the MASH chip, that made our CDs sound better. We hadn't changed the CD, but suddenly it sounded better because we put in the MASH chip that converted the math coming, the ones and zeros, the slices coming off that CD into something a lot smoother and nicer. So what that is quite simply is math that takes this point and interpolates. It smooths between. So this might be our lovely perfect analog wave. This might be what's stored on the disc, the silver shiny thing that hopefully you haven't used as a coaster and damaged, because then you will have problems. The math, that intersample math, will render exactly this. And if you have access to somebody who has a proper oscilloscope, and I don't necessarily mean something on screen, then you can actually see that they're indetectable by machines, meaning that humans can't tell the difference at all, because believe me, we are pretty inaccurate kinds of machines. So this whole thing of saying that sampling is bad and evil and going to kill us all and ruin everything is by some people choosing to do their own kind of sampling, which is taking some bits of information, throwing away all the ones that are inconvenient for them, and then creating a new truth out of that. Yes, there are time slices, and yes, there are gaps between those time slices. But remember, at 44,100 slices in 1 second, that's a lot. That's a very lot. So the gaps between these poles is incredibly tiny, therefore the math required to bridge is infinitesimal. We just needed the processing power. We've now got the processing power to do it. Computers. My first Windows machine ran Windows 97, so I assume it was about 1998 when I got that. And, well, the onboard sound card was a little as your father. I got a Creative Sound Blaster, but I got the good one. That was an EMU converter. That sounded pretty good. It was noisy, but it was pretty good. And then some various other computers, and the Realtek still weren't that good. And then I got one, I can't remember what it was. I think it might have been my first Dell XPS. And it said on the back that it had these 2490 converters and it had the Waves logo on them as well. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I plugged it in before I'd plugged in all of my other gear so I could listen to some music. It's like, oh, hello, that's nice. So the Realtek cards now sound surprisingly good. I've not A/B'd it against my Evo 4, but if it wasn't for the latency thing, why would I need an Evo 4? If it wasn't for the microphone thing, why would I need an Evo 4? The affordable technology has gotten so good that the intersample math and what have you, it's a non-thing. Is analog better? Well, I'm sorry, it's not. Now, I did say that there was a reason to still consider higher sample rates, and that is called oversampling. What happens is this. Let's pull this one out of the game. Oh, look, we've got Hertz delay running an instance, just giving us a little bit of chorus. And look, it's VST3 in Reason. 2.5 just came out. VST3 is a doable thing. Let's take our sound. Let's add some more overtones. Going pretty well. I can hear a tiny bit of aliasing, which we wouldn't hear in speakers. Going pretty well. Now, Reason is surprisingly good for its own instruments and what have you. It seems to have some sort of band limiting thing. I say seems to, I'm just assuming, but it does seem far more resistant to aliasing of a bad nature than many other things. But let's be unkind. My Casio CZ was prone to doing that with almost anything above C4. Middle C, C4 and upwards. Oh, prone to sounding like that, only nastier. So it was... Now what we've got here is aliasing. The reason that our 44K sample rate delivers 22K of listenable range is because above that point, commonly referred to as the Nyquist point, named after Mr. Nyquist, who did all this math and has yet to be disproved, has said, and accurately, is that when a frequency is put into the digital system that is greater than the sample peak, so at 44, it'll take 22. If we feed in something above it, it'll tend to actually bounce back. And you can hear this here. Hear how that suddenly drops in frequency quite dramatically? I mean, it's dropping... It's dropping several octaves. What's happening is that frequency point, it can't be handled above what we call the Nyquist, So it actually bounces back into the signal in an inverted form. So we get what's called aliasing. And aliasing noise can sound good. The Access virus, which was famous for its amazing, big, meaty sound, aliased like a bastard. It really did. Compared to the people obsessing over their VST being slightly imperfect, I went and played with the virus. I was like, what's so amazing about this? And it was an impressive synth. And it's like, there's quite a bit of aliasing in here, but it was reasonably low in the mix, but it was all the way through. And that was part of why it sounded so good. But once we got too much of it, it just sounds nasty or very sort of industrial. And we're not necessarily looking for that, especially in our lovely... That's not jazz anymore, really. It's not even really EBM. It's just horrid. So oversampling is the way of increasing our sample rate. So at the moment I'm working at 44.1. If I move to 48... Oh, that's improved. It's not as great as it was, but it's improved. So it's moved an octave up. 44, 88, so it's doubled our sample rate. And therefore, where we're encountering a problem there, if I move exactly an octave up, that's where it happens again. It's doubled our sample rate, therefore each octave doubles. It allows us another octave of passably clean audio. And then we go up to 96. It's not perfect. And we've got another half an octave. If we go again, we've now got effectively perfect play right up to the highest key I've got. And it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 octave keyboard, a 61 key keyboard. So we've extended our range. The trade-off is obviously our computer is having to work harder. Now, oversampling is a method in which we take the incoming signal. Let's say this device was doing oversampling. I don't know whether it does or doesn't, don't really care. Then we would take it as it hits the device, increase the sample rate. So the math is all done up here, therefore moving the Nyquist point, hopefully above where we're going to have nastiness, and then converting it back down again on the way out of the plugin. Takes some overhead, but it doesn't take as much overhead as running our DAW overall at the higher rate. Because most things do not need oversampling. People will try and tell you that everything needs oversampling all the time, but if it amuses them and they've got a fast enough computer to do it, I believe for them, but it's not necessary. But there's also a trade-off. This is going to be very hard to hear. This will be hard to hear, but if we take our rates, it changes ever so slightly. So not every synth is going to behave or play back. In the early days of VST, they commonly behaved quite poorly when you changed rates. Reason is reasonably good in the sense that we could be working at 44, knowing that our FM is going to sound a little imperfect. We could render it at a really high rate and then pull it back into Reason in a file and render it out at 44.1. And it's going to sound great. We can be running our session at 44.1, pulling in this 192, and it's just going to adapt. It's going to sound great. We render it out, it's going to sound great, because Reason's just done the automatic resampling stuff. I have done it. Have I gained anything from doing it? Well, unless it was an ugly sound, no, I haven't, but things will tend to sound a little different. There is also an argument that we need to be aware of before we get into the highest is best, is that highest isn't always the best. There are some problems which we will just touch on a little bit later. So when people come in and they go, but what's the best rate? Invariably using one of these sorts of pictures of gnarly time slices, then the best rate is 1644 because it's incredibly practical in that it actually takes into account what is going to be using this. Not only your computer and its bandwidth requirements in data and in ability to chunk data, it's also taking into account the human requirements and our ability to chunk data. And that if we simply spend a lot of time and energy delivering more than we can use, it's a waste. So we really want to say, what's the best? Then the best is not the highest number. The highest number is probably problematic, not just in terms of our chunkability, but it's like you're wasting a lot of resources. Being a mix engineer, a record producer, is about efficiency. How do I tell the most powerful story with the least amount of stuff? Babe, I'm leaving, must be on my way, is relatively sparse for words. But the meaning out of babe, I'm leaving, must be on my way, sticks, I'll try and remember to pop up a picture, is pretty high. So it's what we might call a maximum output for a minimal input. It's not a minimum input. I'm out of here. Might be less, but the reality is we're getting a good value, a great return for a nice streamlined input. That's a good songwriter because babe, I'm leaving, must be on my way. It's a great start to a song. Whether you like the song or not, it worked and it was a hit and it stayed on FM radio for a decade or so. It works. So your job as a writer, a composer, a record producer, a mix engineer is to work out how to be efficient. So your best rate is the standard CD 1644 because it's efficient. The other thing that we need to look at is, well, why does digital sound bad? Well, digital sounds bad not because digital is bad, largely because what we want to hear and what digital are doing are not the same thing. Remember I talked about NS10s before? NS10s were a wonderful speaker. They were actually technically too good. Yamaha, in their pursuit of natural sound, really kind of delivered the best speaker ever made. It was fearsomely accurate, and people didn't like it. And therefore it found its home in recording studios because it was fearsomely accurate. Doesn't mean that the mix engineers who were listening to them particularly liked them. I quite liked them because I actually quite like that much clarity. But most people didn't. They'd stick bits of paper over them. They'd do all kinds of things to try to make them smoother. But the reality was their fearsome accuracy became part of why they were such a powerful tool in making records that fired anywhere. That was a period where we had records that just about all translated everywhere. Records that were made before that, it's not that they were made with bad speakers, but the speakers may not have been such a best representation of real world and other places. Therefore, it could sound good on certain kinds of speakers and not quite as good. It always sounded good, like Bat Out of Hell always sounds amazing. But technically, if you stop and listen to it technically, you're like, technically this is a bit poor. Which I think if it was mixed on NS10s, it probably would have sounded better. Just because there's probably a mismatch between the speakers they worked on to mix that and whatever we're running right now. Probably our speakers right now are even better quality than what they had back when they were doing it. Now, the thing that we have to come to terms with digital is that it just goes right the way up there, all the way up. And we don't actually like hearing that much high end. So it's on us to work out effective ways to roll that off. So if I use this doohickey, which I've reviewed, there's a whole review, I'll try and remember to pop up the picture. This becomes nicer sounding. This can sound clinical. So just that alone warms it up. So it's on us. That's not the fault of digital, it's not the fault of DAWs, it's just the fault of us for going, we want the most perfect recording system known to mankind, and then being upset when it's perfect and not bothering to work out how to make what we want as perfect. So enter all of the saturators, mungifiers, some of which are really, or many of which are really very stupid. This one appealed to me and has stayed in use ever since. Part of why I reached out to them and said, hey, can I review this? Because I think it's a cool device. It's got character, despite the annoying things that go around and aren't rad. So you can experiment with different characters. And that influences what we feel like we hear. And I'm not going to get further into it here, but part of the argument against digital is simply a lack of understanding of what we need to do to make this perfect recording system sound emotively perfect. Because technically perfect and emotively perfect are not the same thing, but people make the mistake of putting their emotive in the technical slot and then making them the same thing. Remember, Bat Out of Hell doesn't actually sound that great, technically, but Bat Out of Hell is like as a record. But that's what matters. So is analog better? No. There's just a lot of myth-making about it. Digital is better. 1644 is the most practical, with the exception of oversampling, but oversampling doesn't mean that you change your project rate from 1644, it's just doing a step up process, step down. If there is a situation where you really want to export higher, by all means, if your band is Supertramp and you know that your 4 followers are obsessed with buying things only when they're at 64-bit 192k sample rate, brilliant, run them off a copy like that, let them pay $48 for it. Doesn't mean that it's any better or going to sound any different, despite how they feel like it's going to sound, because they've got these numbers on the special-looking case to tell them how special they are. Which brings me to the final part of this, is that we look at some of these a little bit more directly. Some of the argument, there are many, many other arguments, but I'm just going to pick some of the common ones. And that is this section, is that the point is to enjoy music. I've already gotten that across, hopefully, and that pseudoscience is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. It's like those candles, you know, where you light a kind of a candle and stick it in your ear. Oh, because ears don't get rid of their wax. You've got to do it with our special candle thing that'll do it. Not only is that really bad for your ear, it's poor science, ask any doctor, but unless there's something really wrong, in which your candle will be useless, your ear will naturally toss wax out, which is why the bit that you can stick your finger in does get waxy, because your ear is constantly, the skin in your ear is constantly working its way out. It's kind of creepy and weird when you think about it, but skin inside ears is constantly moving out. Therefore, if there's a bit of wax or a dead bug stuck to it, that's actually going to work its way out, eventually to fall on your shirt and ruin your chances with Kylie Minogue. So the point is to enjoy music. Analog rules, digital sucks, we've largely covered that. Largely that is some kind of an emotive feeling, and people are entitled to their feelings, but feelings and facts are not the same. That is pseudoscience. So people who run around and try and tell you that digital sucks, well, that's okay. Bully forum, some of them really very, very charming people. Some of them are just people who want to be bullies, and they've found something that can't fight back. Because digital doesn't really exist, you know, it's not like you're going to meet Mr. Digital and find that he punches you in your face. Therefore, you can pick on him and actually seem very cool to a whole pile of other people who are immediately going to be like, yeah, dude, you know, digital sucks. So don't go down that path. Digital is perfect. If you think it sucks, then you just got to deal with what you're doing or not doing to get the sound that you want or get rid of the sound you don't want. Higher must be better. We've already covered that to a great extent. Higher is not better, largely because there's no particular advantage in it other than oversampling. But that doesn't mean that you're rendering out a higher rate or recording at or working at a higher rate. Oversampling is a clever solution to running everything at a stupidly high rate. There is some argument, and I'll put a couple of references towards the end of this. There is some argument that working at incredibly high sample rates, which is like 192, is potentially going to give us some real problems, that we can end up with conflicts of things up there and they will just scream. I don't know much about it. I don't work up there. It's vaguely interesting, but I don't care because I'm not going to be doing it. But they are already realizing that it may not be as smart as we think, that we could well be out clevering ourselves. So higher is not always better. Like people who get vast amounts of money, they must be happier than all of us. Yeah, good luck with that one. One we do here is kind of the other way round. The one that sort of says, well, what do we care? It doesn't, we could run it all at 8-bit 11K because everybody uses those stupid earwax buds that sound like poop. Therefore, it doesn't matter what we use. Yep, I get your point. But the reality is, while a certain percentage of sad individuals only ever listen on earbuds, they're not the total of humanity. There are people who have nice systems, and then there are those freaks who buy the crazy, overly expensive version of Supertramp, who have bizarrely, freakishly expensive and hopefully somewhat good audiophile equipment. They might be listening to your record too. Don't rule them out by giving them something that's just going to sound god-awful to them. Okay, maybe they only listen to Supertramp, but what if you could be the new Supertramp? You could make a killing selling them stupid sample rate CDs. But the thing is, poor gear is not a reason to use poor methods. When you're writing, mixing, producing, all this kind of stuff, your job is to speak to the people who are going to want to listen to you. Now, that's not one person. That's a range of people. There are a huge variety of people who like Metallica. They're not all long hair, pasty-faced, zitty, incapable of getting girlfriends. Quite a lot of them actually have girlfriends, and some of them are quite cute, I gotta tell you. Same with Supertramp people. Yeah, I'm picking on Supertramp, but there are people other than those who have hi-fi or audiophile gear who listen to and enjoy Supertramp. Go figure. But it exists. So don't be narrow or silly. Listening on poor gear is not an excuse for using poor methods of doing things. Future-proof. This one sounds like a good argument. It's right there with the higher must be better. If we recorded at higher sample rates, then we're future-proofing, because in the future everything's going to be bigger and better. Okay. Old Hank, recorded with one mic hanging from the ceiling, Hank Williams. And it went on to poor quality tape by our standards. But is Hank's singing any better or worse now? No. If we're judging by the quality of the material, remember, the point is to enjoy music. Doesn't matter the technology that it was recorded on. Yes, we might notice the difference, but remember, we can't tell the difference once we get past 1644. And before you say, but I can, okay, great, I'm not going to come between you and your God, you and your feeling. But where there have been actual scientific studies done, like sciencey, using the rules of scienciness, then they find that people can't tell the difference, and that people largely, including audiophiles, people who are like about it, in blind A/B tests commonly can't tell the difference with MP3s as well. Probably not the 128 ones, but with the really high bitrate 320s and what have you, people can't tell the difference. Particularly when it comes to 1644 against 24-bit, 96 or what have you, they can't tell the difference. As in, the results are at best inconclusive. Therefore, they are guessing as to which is better. If you are looking at a picture, just like if I turn this on, let's say this, you can see me switching this on and off. Let's get this. Okay, there's an audio difference. But does the quality sound any different? You're probably going to tell me that this one sounds better because it's louder, but there's no difference. There is no difference, but people will have an emotive opinion that it's different. Future-proofing, why? Besides, what do we know about what the future's going to be? Maybe our digital stuff will still hold. Maybe it won't. As in, maybe we can plug our USB into Star Trek future things. Maybe we can't. Maybe our ones and zeros will be immediately readable. Like if I dig out my USB in Star Trek era, I can plug it in. Maybe it won't even read my ones and zeros. Maybe things will have changed that much. The thing is that in between now and then, there's a march of time. Yes, with cassette, there are some things I don't have anymore, but the things that mattered enough to me, I put them in my cassette deck, recorded them onto my computer, they're now in my MP3 library. I can listen to Post No Bills. I can listen to The Pressman. The same with Minidisc. Some of my own work will, well, disappear. It's there. My Minidisc player, as far as I know, still works, but I haven't got round to actually converting them. That means it doesn't really matter for the future unless something happens. If I suddenly become uber famous and people want my back catalogue, then I'm probably going to pay somebody and say, look, here, take these things away, bring them back as digital. 1644 will do, dude. It really will. That's future-proofing. If the future has no interest in it, what does it matter whether it exists or not? Making crazy recordings now, making crazy ideas now based on a future that probably isn't going to happen, you've got no control of anyway, is just wasting your time. The other one is that you wouldn't understand. Okay. No, I don't. I plain don't. But maybe you don't understand either. Maybe you don't understand why your argument doesn't hold up for somebody else. Which means that if you can't support your argument with science, facts, figures, logic, if you can't build a logical reason for your argument, analog's better because it is, man. 9 out of 10 penguins can tell you this. Well, sir, penguins don't talk, nor do they actually listen to music, MP3, earbud, or otherwise. Therefore, your scientific argument is not science, it's pseudoscience. So you wouldn't understand simply means you probably don't understand what your real issue or your real argument is. That's getting into psychology, but this is really important for us as songwriters, as composers, as record producers, as mix engineers. We've got to be able to pull up something, an argument, and say, what are the pros, what are the cons? And if the best argument that we can build to support our feeling is that 9 out of 10 penguins prefer this, or something that's equally invalid in pure hard science terms, like this one, looks great on paper, looks like a great argument, oh yeah, that digital music, that sounds like crap, it's obvious, I can see from the picture it sounds like crap, but it's forgotten, missed out, deliberately omitted the important fact, which is the intersample math, that makes it all smooth again. Therefore, it's an invalid argument. It's 9 out of 10 penguins. So if you can't support your argument, you need to be able to actually say, you know what, I like that idea, but it's not working. I need to move on and pick another idea. Find its true merits and work it based on its true merits. Remember, the thing that makes great record producers, great mix engineers, great songwriters is the ability to work on the big picture by doing little things. Those that fail over and over and over, regardless of talent or otherwise, but talent often is what I'm talking about, have limited to no ability to see the big picture and work on the little details. They obsess over the little details, therefore they go on and on about things like sample rates, like if I can get the right sample rate, then I'm going to have hits. Remember Old Hank? By modern standards, in the first few seconds sounds terrible, but Old Hank, as a fan to listen to, is unbeaten. So build logical arguments, not emotive arguments. Now, I said there'd be a couple of references, a lot more references. This is a lifetime of learning, understanding, and what have you. But because people want to see references in situations like this, then I'll give you a couple of them. One of them is actually in an unexpected place. It's in the Fruity Loops studio manual. Yeah, right there in the online manual for Loopy Loop Loops of Fruit, there is a wonderful section on digital audio, the pitfalls, and the crazy stupidity that goes on with regards to DAW wars. They've got a couple of videos you can watch, which are proper videos with proper science in them, properly explained, and it's well presented stuff. This is correct. The other one is a recent-ish article from Sonic Scoop, The Science of Sample Rates and When Higher is Better and When It Isn't. And that matches what I'm talking to you about as well. And I'm not saying they're good because they match what I'm talking about. I'm saying they're good because they actually present rational arguments and are rational rather than 9 out of 10 penguins prefer as their arguments for why something sucks. And the moment anybody says something sucks, especially with a U and an X, then we know that they're being emotive and they're basing all their opinions on the opinions of 9 out of 10 penguins, and they've never met a penguin in their life. So I'll pop up those links. Good luck actually following them, but they are there. Maybe we can get them in the info box, but I'm not promising you those because that one's out of my control. So final words is, if you're worried about sample rates, what have you, don't. Just pick the one that works. The important one, the useful one, the standard one, which was built for a very, very good reason by people way smarter than you and me put together. Good old Mr. Nyquist out of the Bell Laboratories, 16K44.1. 1644, run your projects at that. If you are running something that's likely to produce an awful lot of overtones, like my FM synth here, which is common enough with distortion units, they can tend to run a lot of we can hear Nyquistian action happening here. Nasty. Like those notes there are already troubled. They're even more troubled now. Nasty, nasty, nasty. Then, yes, being able to selectively upsample this guy and upsample this guy would make an awful lot of sense. But running our whole system at a much higher rate makes no real sense at all. Remember, what matters here is the music. And the music is not a result of your emotively perfect approach to ones and zeros. The music matters as a result of the emotive perfection of the composition and the performance, and then the mix. If you are missing the emotive perfection of the composition, the performance, and the mix, it doesn't matter what your sample rates are, it's still going to be meh at best. If not, yeah, thanks, I'll turn that off. I was listening to something the other day, music I'm predisposed to liking. I don't want to mention it because I don't know whether they'll land them as a client or not. But the problem was, while it was pretty cool and I would have been happy enough to have that record appear in my collection, the difficulty was that the singer wasn't prepared to commit. He had a fine voice, he was capable of doing a much better job, there was nothing wrong with him, but he wouldn't commit to his songs. So where he needed to deliver real engrossing passion, drive, something to drag me in, it was just too safe. And, there's worries about auto-tuning and this, that, and the other. It's like, bugger off with the auto-tuning thing, man. You need to grab me by the feelies. And that's not a technical thing because you're worrying about your technicalities. You're not actually really engaging, which is why I can listen to old Hank recorded in 1946 or 47 or 48 or whatever that sounds technically poor, and after a few seconds you forget about the technicality of the quality of the recording because you're so engrossed in this guy who just grabs you by the tears and gets more of them out, and that's what matters. Sample rates and stuff like that, Preferably find a DAW that's sample agnostic, set your rate to 1644, and then get on with what matters, which is really grabbing me by the feelies. If you have any broad questions about this, pop them on below, preferably after hitting subscribe. We love to actually have engagement. I know a lot of people don't engage these days, but please go for it. Ask them on down below. Otherwise, get out there, try these things, and most importantly, have a great day and make some amazing music.